The world had long since descended into chaos. What had started as a terrifying outbreak, a virus that turned the living into ravenous, flesh-hungry monsters, had transformed the earth into a wasteland. Cities fell silent, their once bustling streets overtaken by the undead. Humanity had been pushed to the brink of extinction, yet even the monsters who once roamed with unending hunger were now starting to change. It began slowly, barely noticeable at first. The groaning, limping masses of undead that had once moved with unnerving purpose had begun to lose their drive. At first, the survivors thought it was just a temporary lull, a pause in the relentless aggression of the horde. But the lull stretched on, and the zombies, once so eager to devour the living, now appeared, weaker. Diana, one of the last surviving members of a small group of humans, had seen it firsthand. She and her companions had taken shelter in an old abandoned library on the outskirts of a deserted city. Days had blurred together as the survivors scavenged for food and water, always on the lookout for the next wave of zombies that might come wandering through. But today was different. Diana peered through a crack in the library's front door, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and curiosity. The familiar shuffle of undead feet could be heard just beyond the glass, but the sound was softer than usual. She watched as a group of zombies stumbled past, their movements sluggish and uneven. One of them, a woman who had once worn a wedding dress, seemed to almost collapse, her arms barely lifting as she reached out toward a nearby door. The air around them was eerily quiet, save for the occasional moan that slipped through their rotting lips. "This isn't right," Diana muttered to herself, her voice barely a whisper. She turned to her group, gathered in a corner, huddled over a map and whispering among themselves. "We're going to have to leave soon," Diana said, her voice steady despite the unease that filled her. "There's not much food left. If we don't move, we'll starve here." Her companion, Mark, glanced at her, his tired eyes reflecting the same fear she felt. "We don't know what's going on out there. I've been seeing them too. The zombies, they're changing." "I don't like it," another survivor, Elena, added. Her voice shook as she tried to hold herself together. "The hunger's been gone for days. They're just standing there. Like they're waiting for something." Diana frowned, rubbing her eyes in frustration. The once ferocious zombies now seemed lost, directionless. They had always been driven by an insatiable need to feast on the living, but now they were wandering aimlessly, as though the very thing that made them monsters had been taken from them. What if they're just dying? Diana asked, the thought creeping into her mind. Mark raised an eyebrow. Dying? How could that be? They're already dead. But they're fading, Diana replied. The virus, maybe it's changing. Maybe they're losing what little life force is left in them. A chill ran through the group. The idea that the undead could deteriorate was something they hadn't even considered. The very thought of a world without zombies was unthinkable, yet here they were, faced with the possibility that the monsters who had once been humanity's greatest threat might now be fading into oblivion. Diana shook her head, unwilling to get lost in speculation. We can't afford to wait around and find out. We need to move. As the survivors gathered their things and prepared to leave, the group couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. They had been living in fear for so long, always one step away from death, that the sudden stillness of the world outside felt unnatural. The air felt thick, heavy with uncertainty. Was this a new kind of threat? Or was the world finally moving beyond the horror they had once known? With their packs strapped tight and weapons in hand, the survivors slipped through the library doors, their eyes scanning the streets. It was eerily quiet, save for the distant rustling of the wind and the faint sounds of zombies moaning in the distance. As they walked cautiously through the abandoned streets, Diana couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something far worse was on the horizon. The fading zombies weren't the end of their problems, they were just the beginning. A low growl echoed from behind them, breaking the silence. Diana's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the sound of a zombie. It was something different. Her breath caught in her throat. Run, she yelled, pushing the others forward. The survivors sprinted down the street, hearts pounding, as a new kind of terror slowly crept closer. Something was out there, something far worse than the fading shadows of the undead. The group stumbled through the empty streets, their breath ragged and hearts hammering in their chests. The strange growl from behind them had sent a chill through their bones, but it wasn't the undead that pursued them. The noise was deeper, more primal, and far more unsettling. Diana led the way, her hands trembling around the hilt of her knife. The others followed closely, eyes wide with fear, as they darted between crumbling buildings. The eerie silence of the city pressed in on them, amplifying the danger that loomed just out of sight. They rounded a corner, desperate to put as much distance between themselves and whatever was following them. But when Diana stopped, her eyes scanning the street ahead, she felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. "Wait. What's that?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. Diana raised a hand to silence him. Ahead, the street was filled with what could only be described as shadows, dark figures moving in the distance, hunched over and disjointed. At first, they looked like zombies, but there was something wrong. These creatures didn't shuffle like the undead. Their movements were erratic, unpredictable, as if they had no purpose but to survive, whatever that meant anymore. "I don't think they're zombies," Diana murmured, her voice tight with suspicion. "Then what the hell are they?" Elena asked, her voice strained as she glanced over her shoulder nervously. Diana watched, mesmerized yet horrified. The creatures were different. They weren't rotting in the same way the zombies had been. There was a strange, almost fresh quality to them, but not in a good way. Their skin seemed thin, stretched too tight over their bones, almost translucent. Where zombies once had vacant eyes that gleamed with hunger, these things had eyes that gleamed with something else, intelligence, a desperate cunning. "They're evolving," Diana whispered in horror. "They're not zombies anymore. They're something new." The new creatures were hunched, but they moved with a speed and fluidity that made Diana's blood run cold. As they emerged from the shadows, it became clear that their limbs were longer, their forms more twisted. Their faces were grotesque, but strangely, they seemed to retain fragments of human features, a chilling reminder of what they once were. A low growl resonated from one of them as it neared a fallen car. The creature's hand reached out to touch the rusted metal, its fingers elongated and sharp. Then, it turned toward the survivors, its glowing eyes fixing on them with an unsettling awareness. "Run!" Diana shouted, her instincts kicking in. The group broke into a sprint, their only focus on getting away from the creatures. The new breed was fast, but the survivors had the advantage of knowing the terrain, at least, they thought they did. They ducked into alleyways, darted through buildings, and took every turn they could to lose their pursuers. But the creatures were relentless. They adapted to the environment, learning quickly, and closing the gap with terrifying precision. "What the hell are we dealing with?" Mark gasped, looking over his shoulder. "They're not zombies." "I don't know what they are, but they're dangerous," Diana responded through gritted teeth. "We need to find somewhere safe, now." Elena stumbled, almost falling to the ground as she tried to keep up. Diana reached out and grabbed her arm, pulling her up. "Stay close," she ordered, her voice firm. The group reached an old, dilapidated building and scrambled inside. Diana slammed the door shut behind them, her hands shaking as she locked it. They collapsed against the walls, gasping for air. "What the hell was that?" Elena whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Those things, they were too fast, too smart. They weren't like the zombies." "They weren't zombies at all," Diana said, staring at the floor, her mind racing. "I don't know what they are, but they're different. And they're dangerous." Mark sat down beside her, his face pale. "You think there's some kind of mutated version of the virus?" Diana shook her head. "I don't know. Maybe. But I'm not sure that's the only explanation. This isn't just the virus changing the dead, this is something else entirely." A silence settled over the group as they processed what had just happened. It wasn't just the undead that had changed. The world itself seemed to be shifting, evolving into something unrecognizable, something far darker. "We can't stay here," Diana said after a long pause. Those things will find us. We need to keep moving. We'll have to fight them, Mark said, determination in his voice. We can't just keep running forever. No, Diana replied sharply. We need to find answers. If we're going to survive this new world, we have to understand what's happening. The survivors knew that they were no longer just fighting for their lives against zombies. They were up against a force that was evolving, adapting, and growing stronger by the day. The monsters they had known were fading, but something far worse was taking their place. And Diana knew, deep down, that the real horror was just beginning. The hours dragged on as Diana and her group huddled in the crumbling building, trying to process the horror they had witnessed. The creatures that had once been simple zombies had now transformed into something far more dangerous. The fear that gripped them wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about understanding what was happening to their world. Diana paced the dimly lit room, her mind spinning with questions. What had caused the change in the zombies? Why were they fading, becoming weaker, and then suddenly evolving into these new, horrifying creatures? She couldn't shake the feeling that the answers lay somewhere beyond the city's borders, but finding them meant risking everything. We need to move, Diana said, breaking the silence. The others looked up at her, their expressions weary, their fear still palpable. Mark was the first to speak. You're right. We can't stay here for too long. Those things are out there, and we've seen what they can do. But we can't keep running without a plan, Elena said, her voice trembling. If we don't figure out what's going on, we'll never survive. We're just running from one threat to another. Diana's eyes narrowed. Elena was right. The old methods of survival, running, hiding, and scavenging, were no longer enough. They needed answers. But where could they go? The world outside had long since descended into madness, and the creatures that now roamed it were evolving in ways they couldn't predict. Do you think there's a cure? Mark asked, his voice tinged with a desperate hope. Diana stopped pacing and turned to face him. I don't know. I don't know if this is something we can fix or if it's already too late. But what I do know is that if we want any chance of survival, we need to understand how it all started. We need to get to the source of this. Elena shuddered. The source? Where? Diana hesitated for a moment, considering their options. The virus had spread from one city to the next, but what if there was something more, a central place, a research facility, or a lab where it all began? Somewhere that held the key to what had happened to the zombies and to humanity itself. I think we need to head to the old military base, Diana said, the words slipping out before she could second-guess them. The military base? Mark repeated, raising an eyebrow. You think they have the answers there? It's the only place where we might find some real information. They were studying the virus before it spread. If anyone knows what's happening, it's them, Diana said, her voice firm. Elena exchanged a worried glance with Mark. But the base is miles away, and there's no guarantee it's even safe. Those new creatures might be even more dangerous than we think. I know, Diana replied. But it's our only chance. We can't keep running in circles. We need to know what we're up against. The decision was made, albeit reluctantly. The survivors packed up what little supplies they had left, water, some canned food, and a few weapons, before heading back into the desolate streets. The city was still eerily quiet, the faint echoes of the new breed of creatures reverberating through the abandoned buildings. The group moved swiftly, staying close to the walls, using the shadows to hide from any potential threats. As they navigated through the wreckage of what had once been a thriving metropolis, Diana couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The silence, the stillness, was unnatural. There should have been sounds, the groaning of the undead, the rustle of animals scavenging through the wreckage, but all they heard was the distant howling wind and their own footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Do you hear that? Mark whispered, stopping in his tracks. Diana froze, straining her ears. There it was again, something faint, a low clicking noise, like the sound of something skittering across the ground. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the zombies. It wasn't the new breed. It was something different. The sound grew louder, and suddenly, a dark figure darted across the street in front of them. Diana's pulse quickened. "What was that?" she muttered, her hand instinctively reaching for her weapon. "I don't know," Elena replied, her voice trembling. "But I don't think we should stick around to find out." Without a word, the group broke into a run, heading for the nearest alley to escape the unknown threat. The clicking sound followed them, growing closer, more pronounced. Whatever it was fast, too fast. They darted into a narrow side street, trying to lose their pursuer in the maze of abandoned buildings. But when they reached a dead end, their worst fears were realized. The sound stopped. There was a brief silence. And then, from the shadows, a pair of glowing eyes appeared. A new kind of terror gripped Diana. It wasn't just the zombies or the mutated creatures that they had to worry about anymore. There was something else, something far worse, lurking in the shadows. And it was only a matter of time before it came for them. "Get ready," Diana whispered, her grip tightening on her weapon. "We might have to fight our way out of this one." The tension in the air was palpable as Diana and her group stood at the dead-end alley, hearts pounding in their chests. The creature that had been stalking them was now in front of them, its glowing eyes like twin orbs of malevolent light in the darkness. They could feel its presence, cold and calculating, as it watched them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Diana's hand tightened around the hilt of her knife, her mind racing. What was this thing? It wasn't like the zombies or the mutated creatures they had seen before. It had an intelligence to it, a cunning that felt far more dangerous than anything they had encountered. "What is it?" Elena whispered, barely able to contain the panic in her voice. Diana kept her eyes locked on the creature, trying to gauge its movements. It was tall and lean, its body almost skeletal, with skin that appeared slick and stretched over its bones. Its movements were fluid, like a predator stalking its prey, and it made no sound as it approached. But the most unsettling part was its face, pale, gaunt, with sharp, elongated features and a twisted, almost human-like expression that sent shivers down her spine. "I don't know," Diana replied in a low voice, her eyes narrowing. "But it's not a zombie, and it's not one of the new breed. Whatever it is, it's hunting us." The creature let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that was far more intelligent than the mindless moans of the undead. It took a step forward, and Diana instinctively took a step back. She could feel the weight of her decision to confront this thing bearing down on her. "Get ready," Diana murmured to the others, glancing at Mark and Elena. "If it comes at us, we fight back. Stay together. No matter what." The creature's eyes flicked from Diana to the others, its gaze predatory. It seemed to be weighing them, as though it could sense their fear, could taste their hesitation. Diana's mind screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The alley was a dead end, and the creature had already closed the distance between them. Suddenly, the creature lunged forward with terrifying speed. Diana barely had time to react before it was on her, its claws reaching for her throat. Instinct kicked in, and she slashed at its arms with her knife, the blade cutting through the air in a desperate arc. The creature hissed, pulling back just enough to avoid the strike, but Diana knew she couldn't keep it at bay for long. Mark and Elena sprang into action, throwing whatever they could find at the creature, broken pieces of wood, discarded bricks, anything to create a barrier between them. The creature batted the debris away effortlessly, its focus fixed solely on Diana. "We need to move," Mark shouted, pulling Elena toward the alley's far end. "It's too fast." Diana knew they were right. She couldn't keep this fight going much longer. She spun on her heel, adrenaline surging through her veins as she sprinted toward the nearest building. The creature, undeterred, followed closely behind, its speed nearly matching her own. But as Diana reached the door of the building, something strange happened. The creature hesitated. It paused, its glowing eyes flicking toward the entrance, as though sensing something that made it wary. Diana didn't wait to find out what it was. She dashed through the door, slamming it shut behind her with a thud. For a moment, there was silence. The only sound was the group's heavy breathing as they caught their breath in the darkness of the building. They huddled together, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What the hell was that thing? Elena gasped, her voice shaky with fear. Diana wiped the sweat from her brow, her mind racing. I don't know. But I've never seen anything like it before. It wasn't a zombie. It wasn't the new breed. It was something else, something smarter. Mark leaned against the wall, trying to steady himself. That thing was hunting us. And it's not the only one. If it knows we're here, we're not safe. We need to figure out what we're dealing with, Diana said, her voice grim. If these things are out there, we can't afford to keep running blindly. We need to find out where they came from and how to stop them. Elena nodded slowly. But how? We can't even fight something like that. It was too fast, too strong. Diana stared at the cracked walls around them, her mind turning over the few clues they had. We don't know what's making them smarter. We don't know if they're a product of the virus or if it's something else entirely. But we have to find answers, or we're just waiting to die. We're not waiting to die, Mark said, his voice growing stronger. We're going to survive. We just need a plan. A plan. The word echoed in Diana's mind, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe that they could still make it. But the knowledge that something far worse than the zombies was now hunting them made the road ahead seem more uncertain than ever. They had to find answers. But time was running out. Diana turned to the others, her face set with determination. Tomorrow, we head for the military base. We can't waste any more time. Elena and Mark nodded, their fear still present, but replaced by a flicker of resolve. They didn't know what awaited them at the base, but they knew they had no other choice. As the group settled down to rest, the creature's glowing eyes haunted Diana's thoughts. In a world where even the undead began to fade, the true nightmare was just beginning to unfold. And it wasn't just the zombies that they had to fear anymore. It was the unknown, the creatures that lurked in the shadows, watching, waiting, and learning. Diana awoke to the sound of distant howling, the eerie sound cutting through the silence of the decaying building. She rubbed her eyes, still exhausted from the previous night's harrowing escape. The creature that had nearly taken them was gone, but the tension in the air hadn't lifted. If anything, it felt heavier now, as if the world itself was closing in on them. Morning, Mark whispered, his voice raspy from lack of sleep. He sat against the cracked wall, his eyes scanning the room nervously. Diana nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Today, they were heading to the military base, a place she hoped would have answers, but also a place that could be as dangerous as the creatures they were trying to outrun. We're leaving soon, Diana said quietly, her gaze fixed on the cracked, boarded-up windows. The light of day barely filtered through, casting long shadows across the room. We need to stay low, keep quiet. No one knows we're here yet. Let's keep it that way. Elena stirred from her corner, groaning softly. She rubbed her temples, trying to shake off the fatigue that seemed to settle deeper with each passing day. You think the base is going to have answers? She asked, her voice tinged with doubt. I don't know, Diana replied, her voice distant. But it's our best shot. The military was studying the virus before it spread. If there's any place we might find information on what's happening, it's there. Mark glanced at the door, his jaw tightening. I don't like how quiet everything is. Too quiet. It feels like we're walking into something we don't fully understand. I know, Diana agreed, her eyes narrowing as she considered their path ahead. But if we don't find out what's really going on, if we don't know what we're up against. She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. If they didn't act, they'd be swallowed up by the darkness, by whatever had replaced the old threat of the zombies. The new creatures, the ones that hunted and thought, were something worse. The world had changed, and they had to change with it, or they would be consumed by the shadows. After a long pause, Elena nodded. Let's go. We're not going to survive hiding forever. The group gathered their meager supplies, water, canned food, and a few weapons. They didn't have much, but it would have to do. They couldn't afford to be picky anymore. As they moved through the building, Diana kept her senses sharp, her hand hovering near the knife strapped to her waist. Every creak, every shuffle of air, made her tense. They passed through abandoned rooms, their footfalls echoing in the emptiness, the air thick with the smell of decay. There was no sign of life, no sounds of zombies, no movement from the new breed. But the stillness was almost worse than the chaos. The street outside was eerily quiet too. The buildings were skeletal, standing as decaying monuments to a world long gone. The wind howled through the empty streets, but there were no signs of movement, no creatures in sight. For a moment, it almost felt like the world was holding its breath. Diana led the group down the road, her eyes constantly darting from side to side, scanning every corner, every shadow. They couldn't afford to be complacent. They moved quickly, staying close to the walls, their footsteps muffled by the ruined city. They kept to the back alleys, avoiding the main roads, where they knew the new breed might be patrolling. Diana had no illusions. They had to keep moving, but they also had to be careful. The closer they got to the military base, the more danger they'd be in. "I don't like this," Mark muttered, glancing over his shoulder nervously. "Something's wrong. We should have seen at least one of them by now." "Maybe they're all holed up somewhere, waiting," Elena suggested, her voice tense. "We're being watched." Diana stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. She turned slowly, her eyes narrowing as she searched the abandoned street. Then, she heard it, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, the sound of something skittering across the ground. Like claws scraping against concrete. "They're close," Diana whispered, her pulse quickening. "We need to find cover, now." The group darted into a nearby building, taking shelter behind a crumbling wall. They held their breath, listening intently. The sound grew louder, drawing nearer. Something was moving in the streets, something fast, something smart. "Stay quiet," Diana whispered. "We can't risk being seen." The skittering sound continued, growing closer with each passing second. Diana's heart raced. Whatever was out there, it wasn't like the creatures they had already encountered. This one was different. It was hunting them, just like the other one had, but this time, they had no idea what they were facing. Mark peeked around the corner of the building, his eyes widening as he spotted a shape moving in the shadows. It was tall, thin, and sleek, almost like a spider in the way it moved, its limbs skittering across the ground with unnatural speed. It stopped for a moment, its head tilting as if sensing something in the air. Then it turned, its glowing eyes catching the faint light. Diana's blood ran cold. They had to move, and they had to move now. "Go," she hissed. "We don't have time to wait." With a burst of adrenaline, they sprinted down the alleyway, hearts pounding as they ran for their lives. The creature was close, its clicking sounds growing louder, but the group didn't dare look back. They could only hope they had enough of a head start to escape whatever nightmare this new breed had become. As they rounded the corner, the sound of the creature's pursuit faded. But Diana knew better than to relax. Whatever hunted them in the shadows was out there, and it wasn't going to stop until it had them. And with each passing moment, the darkness around them seemed to close in just a little bit more. The relentless pursuit of the creature had forced Diana and her group into a frantic sprint through the deteriorating city streets. The once familiar skyline was now nothing but a jagged silhouette against a blood-red sky, a reminder of how far the world had fallen. Their lungs burned, and their legs screamed for rest, but there was no time to slow down. The creature was still out there, hunting them like prey, and they couldn't afford to be caught. They ducked into a narrow alley, breathless and shaking. Diana's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but one question kept resurfacing: why hadn't they encountered any zombies recently? The new breed, the creatures with intelligence and speed, had certainly made their presence known, but the typical undead, the ones that had once plagued the streets, had all but disappeared. What had caused this shift? Why were the old zombies fading? "We can't keep running like this," Mark panted, his face pale with exhaustion. "We're just gonna wear ourselves out." "We have to keep moving," Diana replied, her voice strained. "The creature is still hunting us. We can't stop until we're sure we've lost it." Elena, who had been walking quietly behind, suddenly spoke up. What if this is it? What if the world we knew is gone, and these new creatures are the next step in evolution? Diana didn't have an answer. They had seen too much in the last few days to believe in anything that resembled normalcy. The zombies were changing, mutating. And now, there were these strange new creatures, predators that thought, that planned. They were adapting to the world, to the collapse of humanity, and there was no telling what would come next. I don't know what's going on, Diana admitted, looking at her companions. But I know one thing for sure. We can't hide forever. We need to find out what's happening. Mark looked at her with a skeptical expression. And how are we supposed to do that? We don't even know what we're dealing with. Diana's mind raced as she thought of their next move. They had made it this far by keeping one step ahead of the creatures, but sooner or later, they would need answers. The military base was still their best hope. We need to make it to the base, Diana said firmly. If there's anyone left alive out there, it's our best shot. We've been running blindly. But we can't run forever. We need to fight back. Elena frowned. And what if the base is overrun? What if we find more of these things? Diana's eyes flickered with uncertainty for a moment, but she quickly pushed it aside. We won't know unless we go. And if we don't find answers there, we'll have no choice but to head further into the wasteland. We can't afford to keep running in circles. Mark gave a reluctant nod. Fine. But we need to be careful. I'm not convinced we've outrun that thing. And there's no telling what else is out there. The group settled into a tense silence as they tried to catch their breath. Diana's mind was on overdrive, trying to piece together what had happened to the world. The zombies were disappearing, but in their place, new and more terrifying creatures were emerging. Were they a result of the virus mutating? Or had the virus somehow evolved into something entirely different? The possibilities were too overwhelming to consider. Let's move out, Diana said after a moment, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. We need to keep heading south. The base is that way. The group gathered their things, each of them still on edge, their nerves stretched thin from the constant fear. They emerged from the alley and resumed their trek, moving quickly but cautiously through the silent city streets. The absence of the usual groaning, shuffling zombies was unsettling. Every corner they turned felt like stepping into the unknown. The once chaotic world had become eerily still, as though waiting for something to break the silence. Diana's thoughts wandered back to the creature they had narrowly escaped. What had it been? It wasn't a zombie, not even a mutated one. It had been something different, something smarter, faster. Could there be more of them? And what was their purpose? They passed through blocks of abandoned buildings, their surroundings growing more and more desolate with each step. The streets, once filled with the sounds of human life and even the occasional undead moan, now felt like a graveyard. Not just because of the absence of the living, but because the city itself seemed to be decaying, sinking into some kind of stasis. I don't like this, Elena muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. It feels wrong. Diana didn't respond. She was too busy scanning the area around them, her eyes constantly searching for any sign of movement. But the streets remained eerily empty. No zombies. No creatures. No sounds. It was as though the world had fallen into an unnatural silence, as if everything that had been a threat had simply faded away. The silence was deafening, but even worse was the feeling that they were being watched. Diana couldn't shake the sense that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for them to slip up. Suddenly, a loud crash broke the stillness, followed by a series of rapid footsteps. Diana's heart leapt in her chest as she spun around, her knife raised. Out of the shadows, a group of zombies appeared, stumbling toward them with their usual slow, mindless gait. But these were different, they weren't the decaying husks they used to be. They were thinner, frilier, their bodies deteriorating in strange ways, as if even they were starting to fade. Diana felt a wave of confusion. The zombies, they were dying out. But why? Before she could voice the question, the ground beneath them trembled, and from the alley to their right, the creature they had been fleeing earlier emerged, its glowing eyes fixed on them. It had found them again. The hunt wasn't over. Diana's blood ran cold as the creature stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the chase. They were out of time. The silent war between the remnants of humanity and the new predators had only just begun, and there was no way of knowing how it would end. "Run!" Diana shouted, pushing Mark and Elena toward the nearest building. The creature let out a bone-chilling screech, a sound that sent a wave of panic through Diana. They had been living on borrowed time, and now the moment of reckoning had arrived. The building was nothing more than a crumbling ruin, its walls barely standing against the ravages of time and decay. But it was their only option. Diana didn't waste any time, motioning for Mark and Elena to follow her as she led them inside. The shattered glass beneath their feet crunched as they sprinted into the darkened interior, their hearts pounding in their chests. "Upstairs!" Diana commanded, her voice sharp. She could already hear the creature's low growl echoing through the streets. It was getting closer, its hunger palpable in the air. Mark hesitated for a moment, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Diana, are we sure about this? What if?" "Now, Mark!" Diana snapped, her eyes narrowing. "We don't have time for second-guessing." They climbed the stairs quickly, the building creaking ominously under their weight. The sound of the creature's footsteps, fast, calculated, grew louder, shaking the very foundation of the building. It was closing in. As they reached the top floor, Diana slammed the door shut behind them, her breathing heavy. She looked around the room, desperate for any sort of weapon, any way to defend themselves. But the room was empty, abandoned long ago, just like everything else in the city. "Elena," Diana said, her voice firm. "Do you have anything left? Anything at all?" Elena patted the small bag strapped to her back, but there was nothing useful left. Only scraps, empty bottles, and a few canisters of water. Mark cursed under his breath. "We're out of options. We don't have enough ammo, and these things, whatever they are too fast. Too smart." Diana's mind raced as she tried to think of a plan. But the truth was, there wasn't much they could do. They were outmatched. The creature was too powerful, too relentless. Their only hope had been to reach the military base, but it felt like that hope was slipping through their fingers. A sharp noise outside the door sent them all stiffening, every muscle tensing. The creature had arrived. Diana's heart skipped a beat as the door rattled violently. It was trying to force its way in, but it was different from the zombies they had fought before. The creature wasn't mindless. It was aware, intelligent, and it was calculating its next move. "Stay quiet," Diana whispered, motioning for everyone to stay low. "If it's outside, we can't give it any reason to come in." They huddled in the corner of the room, the tension thick in the air. Every breath felt like an eternity. Diana strained her ears, listening for any sign of movement, any clue as to where the creature might be. It was close. She could feel it. Then, the sound stopped. The stillness in the room was deafening. Diana dared not breathe, her hand gripping her knife so tightly her knuckles were white. Had it gone? Was it waiting? Suddenly, the door burst open with a force that shook the walls, and the creature lunged inside. It was faster than they had anticipated, its form a blur of motion as it charged toward them. Its long limbs reached out, claws snapping in the air as it moved with predatory grace. Diana barely had time to react. She threw herself to the side as it lunged toward Mark, its mouth opening wide in an almost animalistic snarl. "Mark!" Diana shouted, scrambling to her feet. But Mark was already backing away, using what little space he had to dodge the creature's strikes. He swung the metal pipe he had scavenged, landing a solid blow across the creature's shoulder. It hissed in pain but didn't stop. Instead, it retaliated with a brutal swipe, sending Mark crashing to the ground. "Elena, help him!" Diana shouted, her voice filled with panic. Elena hesitated for a moment, her eyes wide with terror. Then, without thinking, she rushed forward, grabbing the closest object she could, a broken piece of wood, and swung it at the creature. The creature recoiled, but only for a moment. It was too fast, too powerful. Diana knew they couldn't keep it at bay for long. She darted forward, knife in hand, her mind working faster than her body could react. She had to end this, now. With a quick movement, she slashed at the creature's leg, aiming for the joint. It howled in pain, its balance faltering for just a moment. Diana seized the opportunity, pushing herself harder, faster. She stabbed the knife into the creature's side, feeling the blade sink into its flesh. The creature shrieked, a sound that reverberated through the building, but it didn't collapse. Instead, it grabbed her arm, twisting it painfully. Diana gasped, trying to pull away, but the creature's grip was like iron. She couldn't break free. "Diana!" Mark screamed from the ground. "Get out of there!" But she couldn't move. The creature's claws were digging into her arm, and it was pulling her closer to its ravenous mouth. In that instant, something shifted. Elena, looking frantic and determined, threw a broken chair leg at the creature. The impact distracted it just long enough for Diana to break free from its grasp. She scrambled backward, her body sore, but adrenaline kept her moving. Mark, now back on his feet, lunged at the creature with the pipe again, swinging wildly. The creature turned just in time to block the blow with its arm, but the impact seemed to stagger it. Diana didn't hesitate. She lunged once more, this time aiming for the creature's throat. With a final, desperate thrust, her knife connected, sinking deep into its jugular. The creature gurgled, its glowing eyes dimming. It collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud, its body twitching once before it lay still. For a moment, there was silence. Breathing heavily, Diana stood over the fallen creature, her heart racing. They had done it. But at what cost? Mark and Elena, equally shaken, moved to her side, their faces pale but filled with a mix of relief and disbelief. "It's over?" Mark asked, his voice hoarse. "For now," Diana said, looking down at the creature's lifeless body. "But we still don't know what's really going on." The battle was over, but the war for survival was far from won. The room was heavy with silence as Diana, Mark, and Elena stood over the creature's motionless body. The stench of decay lingered in the air, mixing with the dust that had settled in the old building. Their bodies were battered, their clothes torn, and yet, there was a strange sense of relief that washed over them. The battle had ended, but the questions remained, unanswered and haunting. Diana wiped the sweat from her brow, her muscles aching with the weight of everything they had endured. She looked at Mark and Elena, both of them equally exhausted but alive, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. They had fought off the creature, and they had survived the night. But the fading world around them told another story. A story they weren't ready to face. "Is it really over?" Elena asked, her voice small, barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would break the fragile calm. Diana didn't know how to answer. The creature they had just defeated was no ordinary zombie, no mindless, decaying beast. It had been smart, agile, calculating. And though it had fallen, the world they knew was still changing. The zombies, they were fading, becoming something else, something they didn't understand. And if the creatures like the one they had just fought were any indication, the world was only going to get darker from here. "I don't know," Diana said softly, her gaze lingering on the creature's lifeless form. "But this is just the beginning." Mark, still holding the pipe tightly in his hands, shifted uncomfortably. "The military base is still our best bet, right? I mean, it's the only place left with any kind of real protection, right?" Diana looked at him, weighing his words. They had talked about it before, the hope that the military would have answers, that there was some kind of plan to fight back. But as the days had gone on, that hope had started to feel more like a fantasy. "The base may still be their best chance for survival," she said slowly, "but that doesn't mean it's a safe haven. We've seen too much to think we can just walk in and find answers. The world's changing too fast." "Then what do we do?" Elena asked, her eyes wide with desperation. Do we just wait here until we're all gone? I can't. I won't. Diana closed her eyes, taking a deep breath as she considered her options. Their choices were slim. They could continue to move south toward the military base, hoping it wasn't overrun. But there was no guarantee they'd make it there alive. Or they could turn back, try to survive on their own for a while longer, but the fading zombies and the growing intelligence of the new creatures meant they were just as vulnerable as before. For a moment, it felt like the weight of the entire world had fallen on her shoulders. She couldn't answer Elena's question, not yet. All she knew was that the world they had known was gone. The shadows were taking over, and even the zombies, their former tormentors, were fading into the background, leaving a new, even more dangerous enemy in their place. The only thing we can do is keep moving forward, Diana finally said, her voice steady but filled with resolve. We find the answers. We fight. And we survive. Mark and Elena nodded, but there was no illusion in their eyes. They had seen the worst of what this world had to offer, and yet, they were still standing. It wasn't hope that kept them going, but sheer survival. They weren't looking for salvation anymore, they were simply trying to stay alive. I don't know if there's anything left to fight for, Elena muttered, her voice hollow. But if it means we survive one more day, I'm in. Diana turned toward the broken window, staring out at the city that had once been full of life. Now, it was nothing more than a tombstone of the past. The streets were empty, the remnants of society crumbling into dust. The fading shadows of the zombies and the creatures that had replaced them were the last remnants of the world they once knew. But even in the face of that darkness, Diana knew one thing: they had come this far. And no matter how much the world had changed, no matter how much it had faded, they weren't going to give up. Not now. Not when survival was all that mattered. Let's go, Diana said, her voice firm. We don't stop until we have answers. We don't stop until we understand why this is happening, and how we can stop it. Mark and Elena exchanged looks, a silent understanding passing between them. There was no turning back now. The creature they had fought wasn't the last of its kind, and it was clear that the world was far from finished with them. But they still had their lives, and as long as they did, they would fight to keep them. Together, they walked out of the building, into the darkness of a world that was slowly fading away. The shadows were growing, the air heavy with uncertainty. But Diana was determined. She would survive. They would survive. And they would find a way to fight the fading world, one step at a time.